Hello, everyone. We are just starting to admit people in, so I'll just give it a minute or so before we start. We're hovering at around 45 participants right now. And just so everyone knows, recording has started so that this can be placed on YouTube after the fact. Yeah, so just give it a couple more seconds. That's great, Pete. Thanks so much for letting us know. Oh, good Lord. 500 views, and the autograph request already starting. Okay, so seeing as we're hovering around 50 people, why don't we just get started then? Good morning, everyone. My name is Hugo Wong, and I work at the Building and Safety Standards branch of the province of British Columbia. We are the ones responsible for developing the BC Building Code, among other things. And thank you so much for joining us at this morning's Q&A session about the BC Building Code proposal to make new buildings cleaner and more energy efficient. I will be your MC this morning, and I'll have the pleasure of introducing other members of the BSSB team who will be presenting. So if when I call your name, please give us a wave. We have with us Zachary May, our Executive Director, Tiffany Workington, Director of Building Policy and Legislation, Senior Codes Engineer Scott Williams, Tommy Dang, Codes Administrator, Kevin Harding, Manager of Policy and Legislation, Jenna Hrechka, our Office Manager and Senior Policy Analyst like myself, William Grass, and Megan Gunn. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube, so people who can't make the call can tune in at their convenience. And if you do not wish your likeness to be recorded or posted online, you could consider typing your questions in the chat. There's an anonymous Q&A feature there, or you can call in by phone using the dial-in option. Yeah. So first, why don't I turn over to Zachary May, the Executive Director of the Building and Safety Standards branch, who has a few opening remarks. Zach?
Thanks, Hugo. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking people on whose traditional territory myself and the ministry responsible for housing stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich people whose historical relationships with the land continue to this very day. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the important point we're at in the development of the Energy Step Code and all the collaboration and hard work that has brought us to this important point, not just at the branch, but collectively across the building construction sector. In 2015, we gathered and discussed how to transition towards low energy buildings as a minimum standard, just an idea, a glint in our eye back then for many of us. And by 2017, the Energy Step Code was adopted into provincial regulation and local government bylaws. At that time, we set out a goal of implementing on a voluntary basis and ideally requiring step 3 or 20% better by 2022. That was our ambitious sort of next step target. And we also committed at that point in time to consider at some future point how carbon might be addressed in future codes. That all seemed very ambitious at the time. Implementing the Energy Step Code in 2017 was ambitious, but sure enough, here we are today in 2022, about to take those important next steps with your feedback. I'm very proud of the progress that's been made to bring us to this important milestone. We were the first in North America to establish a clear path towards net zero energy ready in regulation, and it's a credit to everyone involved across British Columbia that we've kept our pace towards that ambitious end goal. This is all possible because of the continued collaboration and hard work by partners at all levels of government and everyone working in the building construction sector to make buildings better every day. I look forward to your questions today. Look forward to your feedback during this public review and your continued support to achieve the province's commitments on improving energy efficiency and reducing carbon emissions in buildings in the months and years to come. Back to you, Hugo.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, so I'll just quickly go over the plan for this morning. Our intention for this session is to clear up any ambiguities that might exist about the code proposal as it currently stands. So you can provide some of the feedback you can be, pardon me, just lost my screen here. So you can provide some informed feedback via the SurveyMonkey tool. And that's the place to go to indicate whether you support the proposal as it stands, support it with changes, or not at all. And so we'll start with some presentation out, addressing some of the most common questions that we've received so far. Now, during that time, you can write your questions in the chat, and Kevin, Will, and Megan will be synthesizing them and passing them on to our presenters when they wrap up. So they can answer them then. And after we take some of those, we can open the mics up and people can use the raise hand function to line up and speak. And so I'll call on people based on the order that their hand was raised. And we can still take written questions at the time if that's how you prefer to ask them. And we can just intersperse verbal questions with the written ones at the time. So first, I'll turn it over to Tiffany, Director of Building Policy and Legislation, who will start the presentation. Tiffany?
Sure. Did you want to just advance to the list of the things we're planning to cover today so everyone can get a little bit of a headline?
Got it. I think it's up, is it?
No.
Can other folks indicate whether or not they can see what's on the screen? I see some thumbs up.
the cover sheet, Hugo. I'm looking for the list.
I can see some thumbs up from the audience, so it's entirely possible that it just might be frozen on your screen.
Okay.
Blind trust.
I will go with it. In that case, what I'm hoping you guys are seeing is a little bit of a list of some of the most common questions that we've gotten from folks looking at the materials that we've posted online. And what we're hoping to do today is add a little bit of clarity to those points that might be a little bit confusing for you folks to really inform that feedback that we're hoping to get from you guys. Lots of inquiries about our costing methodology that we posted online in our support materials, as well as a few questions about implementation and best practices materials. So we'll go over what supports are in progress, and then a couple of nitty-gritty details from Scott on some of the more nuanced technical aspects. Okay.
Sorry, folks, I'm going to restart the presentation. It seems like some people could see the slide and others could not. So I'm just going to give that another go. Apologies, everyone. How about now? Can I get any thumbs up from the crowd or a message in the chat to see if you can see? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. So it looks like we're good to continue. Nope.
I think we can see it, Hugo. It's just that we're given the ability to actually navigate through the slides, where I think it would be best if maybe you just advance the slides as opposed to each individual participant.
Okay, while I work on that, why don't we just keep going and I
Sure.
can see if I can synchronize everything here. So let's move on to slide 4.
Okay, so if you're looking for more information about the proposals and all of the interpretive supports that we've produced, those are all available online at gov.bc.ca/building codes. Our intention here is not to regurgitate all of those materials. We couldn't possibly do them justice in the time allotted. So that's the best place to start, and we'll be building from those materials today. In terms of providing feedback, you'll also find a link on that site for the SurveyMonkey, which is where we're hoping you can provide your feedback. That is our preferred and recommended format for the responses. If you're having technical difficulties with that survey itself, you are able to copy the questions and send them to us via email, or contact us via that email to get support with the SurveyMonkey technical aspects. And we'll move on to slide 5. So we've got two changes that we're proposing in this code change proposal. One has to do with 20% better energy efficiency, and it will be required in most new buildings. What you'll notice is that this is similar to step code. Part 9 has step 3 for small, less complex buildings, and part 3 has step 2 for larger buildings. And this is all in service of our ultimate goal to get to that 2032 net zero energy ready for new construction objective. The other part of our proposal has to do with those operational carbon standards. So building carbon pollution standard for local governments to opt into. It applies to new construction, and its implementation is built on the successful model that we saw with the BC Energy Step Code. Local governments can opt in at first. There's 4 different levels to choose from with various amounts of stringency, all the way from measure only to zero carbon ready. And the goal is to get to zero carbon new construction in BC by 2030. So as timing passes, just like with the step code, what we're envisioning is those lower levels will drop off and the increasing levels of stringency will become part of the minimum standard. And I'll give you a little bit more details about those on the next couple of slides. Okay, so slide number 6. 20% better energy efficiency. So what you'll see in our proposal is that we've added a prescriptive compliance path that's comparable to step 3 for part 9 buildings. Those are the smaller, mostly residential buildings. Builders have the choice between prescriptive and performance compliance, and together the performance and the prescriptive paths become the new minimum standard for BC. What you'll also see in our proposal is some changes that are designed to increase parity, increase alignment with the Model National Code, and overall get us closer to where we're trying to get in 2032. So you'll see additional air tightness testing options, which many of you have noted already will add parity for smaller buildings who are just having a really hard time meeting the air tightness testing metrics. We're introducing some other national building code provisions and nomenclature, and you'll also see new energy performance improvement compliance calculation, which are based on the national building code. You'll also see a couple of small changes for metrics to office and commercial occupancies in part 10. And then still under development, we have some adjusted requirements for log homes and small homes in cold climates. So we've made some adjustments to our code proposal to reflect that that work is still in progress and make sure that there are equitable ways for everybody to meet these standards while we're continuing that good work and looking at how we can accommodate those unique building types. On to slide number 7. In terms of the carbon pollution standard, this is the operational carbon pollution standard. So it's looking at greenhouse gases produced from the operation of the building, not energy sources to the building. It's got 4 different levels of increasing stringency, and the levels apply to every climate zone. So rather than having a table for each climate zone, what we've done is we've produced one set of levels that apply to all zones. Local governments can choose to reference these levels at this point. And the idea is that as we move towards 2024, 2027, and 2030, those lower levels will begin to drop off and increasing stringency will be seen in our operational carbon standards. Okay. On to slide 8. So this is an overview of our costing methodology, and at this point, I'm going to pass it to Scott to give us a little bit more information about how that methodology was put together and what you're seeing in those data tables that we have published to our public review site.
Thanks, Stephanie. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay, so I'll just do a quick overview of the sample table that's been provided. So there's a complete set of summary sheets within the metrics research report that has been updated, that's been posted on the public review website as well as the step code website. So you'll have the full suite of all of the different archetypes that were looked at for all of the different climate zones. So this is one of many, and what we have here is a quadplex that is located in climate zone 6 in Cranbrook. So essentially, what we have here is, I wanted to give a general overview of what the actual baseline is for this and how things were measured. So if you look at the bottom of the table, you'll see that we have incremental capital costs as well as changes for operational costs. And so what we did essentially is for each of the given steps that we have outlined, there's a certain number of ECMs or energy conservation measures that were accounted for with regards to those different step levels. So those energy conservation measures remained constant through each of these different steps. And the only thing that was varied was the actual equipment itself in terms of the domestic hot water and the space conditioning equipment. So the baseline is essentially the energy conservation measures associated with that step that stays constant, like it is said. And we start with carbon intensive equipment as being the baseline. So we'll have things like gas-fired domestic hot water and as well as gas-fired space conditioning equipment. So as we move across from the basically moving to the different steps in terms of medium, low, and zero carbon ready, we look at the variances with regards to the different types of equipment. So we're basically, in the onset of this, looking at the different impacts that we would have as associated with the different changes with the equipment. So you'll see that as you kind of move from left to right and towards zero carbon ready, there is some changes with regards to the space conditioning equipment and the domestic hot water equipment and what the associated impacts are with regards to ICC and with regards to operational costs. So one thing I will note is that you'll notice that with regards to the incremental capital cost, it's not necessarily something that is all that drastic in terms of the changing of the equipment. And the reason being is that it's just one system among many that has been analyzed with regards to the overall ECM package that has been used for any given step. So you're not necessarily going to see any big changes with regards to the ICC. However, one thing to take note is that it can be inferred that the change in the ICC, the incremental capital costs, can be in addition to the incremental capital costs associated with the energy conservation measures associated with each different step. So in terms of energy efficiency and all of the different packages that we use to get to that step, it can be inferred and implied that the incremental capital cost that's outlined in this table would be in addition to that. It's not absolute and it's not necessarily linear, but at the same time, it's something that can be considered. Another thing as well, too, is you'll notice that when we move from gas-fired equipment to electric, there is a jump in terms of the operational costs as a result of the increased expenditures due to electricity use. But you will notice that there may be some situations where it's not as maybe drastic as you would have expected. The reason being is that this is analyzed over a 20-year period. In that 20-year period, we've used the carbon tax, and that's escalated. So it goes to 170 to at 2030. So that's $170 per ton. And then it moves to 300 at the end of the 20-year period. So that is somewhat impacting the analysis in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the operational costs. What else did I want to tell you about this? Yeah, I think that's about it for this slide. Do you want to move to the next one, please, Hugo? Okay, so slide 9. So there's a couple things that we just wanted to address, some high-level comments that were provided to us via the surveys that have already been inputted at this point. So there's a few things that have come up, and one of them being is the minimum energy rating for fenestration. So this is something in terms of harmonization with the National Building Code. This is what's being is within the National Building Code for 2020. And this is the minimum energy rating with regards to fenestration. So it's an additional compliance metrics in addition to the U factor. And basically what this applies to is the base prescriptive tables that we currently have within the BC Building Code. So given the way we've structured things and the fact that Part 9 residential will either need to follow the more stringent 20% better prescriptive compliance path, so the modified tables with the increased stringency, or the performance case, or the performance path, there is really limited application with regards to the minimum energy rating for fenestration. And so it's basically going to be applied to Part 9 non-residential or mixed use. It is limited. We have learned that this is something that is being looked at on the national scale and whether or not this is going to be carried forth in future code revisions with regards to the national building codes. This is something that we're going to take into consideration as well too as we move forward with these changes. But that was something that was raised as a concern. One of the concerns being is that with the minimum energy rating, you're looking at, it's essentially a combination of your solar heat gain coefficient, your thermal performance, as well as the air leakage of the actual fenestration product. And so there can be some gaming of that in terms of high solar heat gain coefficient values and then lower thermal performance, which can exacerbate some issues with regards to overheating. So something we need to consider. Another metric that or requirement that we've included within the package of changes is peak cooling load. So within the National Building Code, they have a requirement where when doing the comparative method in terms of the performance path and looking at the reference case to the proposed case, the peak cooling load cannot exceed the peak cooling load of the reference case. So this is an attempt to address concerns with regards to overheating. Concerns have been raised about this requirement through our engagement with stakeholders over the last year or so. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to essentially provide the forum for all others throughout the province to provide comment with regards to this requirement so that we're performing our due diligence and then we can collate those concerns and make a decision moving forward accordingly. The code language with regards to the peak cooling load is a little bit cumbersome as it's been written. So there's some clarity that can be provided there. Essentially, what they're wanting to know is the peak cooling load, right? So the code language, the way it's stated, is essentially it insinuates that additional modeling runs should be done in order to determine what that peak cooling load is and the comparison between the reference and the proposed. When you're using something like ERS or HOT 2000, that's automatically generated. It's not something that you need to do an additional modeling run for. But if you're using other software, that's when that comes into play. So that's just something that I wanted to outline as being some of the nuances with regards to the code language itself. So next slide, slide 10. So there's a lot going on with regards to the application in terms of energy efficiency. And so if you look at 936.13 in terms of application, there's a lot going on there, and we've tried our best to provide the clarity with regards to all of the proposed changes, but I just wanted to highlight what those are. So you'll see in the slide that there's a table on the right, and this is a table that currently exists within the appendix notes within Part 9 that just outlines the application given the different occupancies with regards to Part 9. You will notice that there is an additional row at the bottom with regards to log homes. Like Tiffany was saying, there's additional work that's being done and analysis for log homes as well as small buildings in cold climates. With regards to log homes, we're still waiting on the final numbers, and so we weren't able to make any changes with regards to log homes in terms of energy efficiency in relation to the STEP code. And so what we did is we pulled that out. So log homes will essentially be required to meet the prescriptive tables as they stand within the 2018 prior to revision. And they also have the 936.5 performance path that can be used as well too as a compliance path. So if you look at the first row, this is where there's some nuances. So nothing has essentially changed with regards to the different compliance options with regards to Part 9 residential. But what we have is there's two things that need to be highlighted here is that for Part 9 residential, you will need to follow either the more stringent prescriptive tables that are being proposed in terms of the changes, or the performance path. So you have those two options with regards to Part 9. And then all other occupancies with regards to Part 9 would then follow either the existing prescriptive tables that we have, or they would be fired over to NECB, depending on the different situation. One thing I want to note as well, too, is that with the performance path, we are still using the existing prescriptive tables to formulate the baseline case or the reference case for modeling purposes. So that doesn't change. So the new tables do not affect that process. And you'd still go about your business as you typically would when you're doing the comparative method as you would right now. So next slide, slide 11. One thing I wanted to highlight as well too is that with regards to GHG and modeling, there's quite a few complexities, at least with the Part 9 world, with regards to defining what that actually means in terms of the calculation methodology and the modeling rule set. So this is something that we're going to be working on over the next number of months. And what we're going to be essentially looking at is that providing some clarity with regards to ancillary uses such as cooktops, gas dryers, and fireplaces, and how those actually would get factored into the overall GHG calculation, as well as backup heat as well too. So providing that clarity, obviously building off of the ERS modeling rule set, filling up any gaps that may arise as a result of maybe some assumptions that are being made, and making sure that there's a clear defined methodology for Part 9 with regards to GHGs. With regards to Part 3, we will be following the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines. And so there's not really going to be much change there, but I will express that we will be making some modifications to the Part 9 compliance report or the energy design report to suit all the changes that we're proposing for these upcoming code revisions. So over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Scott. Excuse me. So to supplement those new compliance tools and the new rule set, we're also going to be producing some training and manuals for those tools to make sure that everybody knows how they now work and has a good sense of how to be most effective with those tools. In addition to those implementation supports, we've also got a best practices bulletin. It's currently posted in draft form to the public review site, and the purpose of that is to let you guys know some of the things that we and our great partners within the local government peer network have started to think about in terms of some of the implementation advice, because we know that successful implementation goes beyond the four corners of the code. And we want to support local governments to do this in a way that is regionally consistent as much as possible, and consider some of the best practices and learnings that we've gleaned from the implementation of the STEP code and other local government partnerships. We'll be building on that best practices guidance to refine the bulletin itself, and then there will be more detailed content that we produce after public review completes, based on a more fulsome understanding of some of the feedback we've got and the details of the implementation that we settle on. In addition to that, there will be some complementary Building Act general regulation amendments. So we've got a couple of questions about why those are not up on the public review site. The purpose of the public review is really to review the code language itself. And so you won't see those complementary measures listed there, but rest assured, we are aware that there will need to be some refinements in terms of the STEP code opt-in feature, as well as adding the operational carbon pollution standard to the Building Act general regulation and restriction. Next slide, slide 12. And we're at the end. At this point, we'd like to open it up to you, and I'll hand it back to Hugo.
Thanks so much. So why don't we start with, I'm going to check in with Kevin to see if there's any folks who have listed questions inside the Q&A, or whoever is manning the Q&A. Let me know if there's any questions that have surfaced there.
Great, thanks, Hugo. We have one question in the chat, and it's regarding whether or not the STEP code will follow the latest VMG. And I'll admit that I'm not quite sure what that acronym means. So if any of our panelists know what that means, that would be great.
Yeah, I think that's in reference to the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines. And yes, that's not a change. That's going to be carried forth from what is the current methodology with the STEP code, and that's going to be carrying forth with these changes.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Scott. And Hugo, we have another question that's come up in the Q&A, and there's a couple more popping in. So maybe I'll start with this one and then we'll summarize others. This question is whether or not it's possible to define zero carbon ready and whether or not there's a definition for that in the code.
Great question. So we've actually had a couple of questions about the term zero carbon ready and whether that differentiates at all from the policy objective, which is zero carbon new buildings. And really what that is meant to recognize that the scope of the building code kind of ends at the siding. And so we get the building as ready as we possibly can to be zero carbon and to make really efficient use of those zero carbon energy sources. At the same time, our partners in other parts of government, including energy mines and low carbon innovation, are working on fuel policy and driving that market shift towards decarbonization of fuel sources. So when the two meet in the middle, what we'll have ultimately is a zero carbon building. But what we mean by zero carbon ready is just that the building is as ready as it can possibly be to be decarbonized in terms of its operational use of fuel.
Great. Thank you for that. There's a lot of other questions coming in. So just taking a look at what's going on in the chat, because I think that's where they're mostly coming in at the moment. There's a question here about whether or not the Ghg, the Ghg rating system will remain as a path for Part 9 buildings, and whether or not it's being separated from the step code for Part 9.
Yeah, so it's still a compliance option. What we've essentially done is just to harmonize with the language within the National Building Code. We have pulled out that percent better application or compliance path into a separate table. So as you know, right now within the step code, we have the absolute metrics with regards to Teddy and MUI, as well as the percent better compliance path. We've now separated those out, and so it is a viable compliance path. And you'll see that with regards to the Ghg rating system, within the step code language itself, we do not reference the Ghg rating system explicitly. We've kicked it to 936.5, which then indicates that it is a viable compliance path. So those are the sort of the nuances with the changes there.
Thanks for that, Scott. And just looking at other questions here as well, there's a bunch, and I'm going to try to see if I can group any of them. One that seems pretty easy to start with is a question as to whether or not the building carbon pollution standard will apply to mixed use buildings.
So in terms of Part 3, yes, for sure. And so that would follow the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines for the modeling rule set with regards to that. With regards to Part 9, no, it would not. We've basically followed suit with regards to the energy step code in terms of Part 9 residential. And so mixed use applications do not apply with regards to the step code. And so the same can be said about the carbon pollution standard as well.
Thanks for that, Scott. And I have another question here. This one is in relation to the step code targets or the percentage better pathway. The question is asking for clarification about changes from the current approach and whether or not this means that projects could or could not blend pathways for compliance. Let me know if that makes sense. I'm summarizing it, and I could restate it if we need to.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just like, which question is that?
It's at 10:01 a.m. Proposed 93663 states that
Okay.
compliance shall be. Yep.
Okay, so with regards to the step code, step 3 is going to be the new baseline minimum, as well as the prescriptive path as well too. So we do have basically, and you have within the step code itself, you do have the percent better approach as well as the absolute metrics as being a compliance option. So that doesn't necessarily change from what we have right now, other than having that prescriptive path. So hopefully that answers your question, Gene.
Thanks, Scott. I'm just popping over to the Q&A where another question's come up in relation to occupancy types not falling under step code 10.2.3. Apparently, it looks like occupancies that are not included, such as Group F, would still require compliance with the NECB Part 8 or ASHRAE 90.1. And so there's a question about GHGI on those types of occupancies.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. Those F-type occupancies have not been included within the carbon pollution standard. The reason being is that, again, we wanted to follow suit with the analysis and methodologies that were used for the STEP code. So we used, in terms of the development of the carbon pollution standard, this was all via the metrics research report, which was focused primarily, initially anyways, in terms of energy efficiency and then the occupancies that were included within the STEP code. So we continued our analysis with regards to those archetypes and those archetypes only with regards to the carbon pollution standard. So you'll see with regards to the carbon pollution standard that only the archetypes that are included within the STEP code have been included in the in terms of the GHGI metrics. So those type F occupancies have not been included.
Thanks for that, Scott. Another question is in relation to the anticipated timeline for publishing the GHG modeling rule set. Are we able to share that or provide any indications as to the timeline?
Yeah, totally. So right now we're in the process of developing an RFP, which we hope to issue very soon. And then so that work will carry through the end of this year and into the new year. We're really hoping to have something by early new year, as in February, is what we're looking at. So those are the proposed timelines. There's also the aspect of the supporting material with regards to any of the compliance calculators, and that is something that would carry forth into the new year. So we'll really focus on actually getting the compliance calculators out as soon as we possibly can. All the supporting material in terms of webinars or recorded versions that would be posted on the STEP Code website. That would be something that would come later.
Thanks for that, Scott, and appreciate the work going into it. There's a question about Windows and modeling guidelines for fenestration state modeling, and the fact that the City of Vancouver guidelines may suggest that it needs to be done at actual sizes. The question is whether or not manufacturers would need to provide actual product design modeling data.
Well, like in terms of meeting the requirements with regards to a 440, it's usually a generic size that is being analyzed, and that's what's typically used. In terms of each individual window being modeled and tested, I think that is somewhat cost prohibitive. So we would still follow the same methodology that we currently have within the BC Building Code with regards to that.
Great, thank you for that. Another question about STEP code, NECB, and ASHRAE paths. For projects and municipalities that have not adopted the STEP code, will the choice still remain, or will the STEP code become mandatory for the typologies covered by it?
Yeah, so we have the new minimum baseline requirements. So if you look at in the Part 3 world, we have Step 2 for the archetypes that are listed within the STEP code. Those would be mandatory in terms of compliance. The excuse me, the local government does have the option of opting into higher steps if they like. But as a minimum, Step 2 would be the new base code minimum. With regards to Part 9, you have either the option of Step 3 as being the minimum or the new prescriptive 20% backstop. So that's where we've shifted the dial. So that is the new minimum requirement. Again, with regards to Part 9, should a local government want to opt into more stringent measures, they do have the options of opting into Steps 4 or 5, but Step 3 or the prescriptive backstop is what's the new base code minimum.
Fantastic. Thank you for that information, Scott. Next question that I have is in relation to renewable natural gas. I think it's one that has been involved in a lot of discussions around the province, and it's about whether or not rules may be implemented to require a building to purchase renewable natural gas or pay a carbon offset fine, for example, if they switch from fuel specified in design to a more carbon intensive fuel once the building is operating.
Yeah, great question. Our operational carbon standard has been designed to accommodate new and innovative fuel sources. It's fuel neutral in that sense, or fuel agnostic, some people like to say. So it's outcome oriented. It's meant for any sufficiently decarbonized fuel to be able to meet those targets. What we do know is that there are proceedings ongoing with the BC Utilities Commission to consider RNG and a new tariff structure that has been proposed. Once that decision is made, if additional changes need to be or adjustments need to be made, we'll take a look at what the decision is and analyze what steps we need to take to make sure that we continue to enable all of those sufficiently decarbonized fuel sources in our standard.
Thanks for that, Tiffany. The next question is in relation to local governments and performance-based approaches and the prescriptive path. So can local governments require the performance-based approach and not allow the prescriptive path? And if not, for Part 9, is it correct that an Ghg label will not be generated?
I can speak to the first part, and Scott, maybe you want to speak to the second part about Ghg. The proposal right now is that the new minimum standard gives the builder the choice between the prescriptive and performance paths. It's not a situation where the Building Act general regulation would allow a local government to prescribe one compliance path versus the other.
Yeah, and just to answer that second part, with regards to Ghg label, if it's not being modeled, then an Ghg label can't be generated. So with the prescriptive path, that's not an option.
Great, thank you both. Following up on that, I'm just going to go out of order a little bit. There's a question about energy emissions factors and whether or not they'll be updated regularly or if there'll be a fixed value, for example, from the Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so in terms of what we've done for the carbon pollution standard is we've referenced the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines and the emissions factors that are within. And so we've essentially used that as application across the entire province. In terms of changes with that, those will remain static for a time, and then we will obviously, if there are some changes with regards to those emissions factors, then that is going to affect how we potentially approach the metrics. So we'll actually change the metrics, but it's something that can be entertained. But at this point in time, we're looking at a static value. And with future code revisions, that's something that we could obviously consider with regards to changed emissions factors. Tiffany, do you have anything else to add there?
Well, I'll just add that the philosophy there is really to drive a particular set of behaviors. We're asking people to decarbonize major systems first. And when you look at it from that philosophical perspective, the emissions factor and the targets are intimately related. So if you change one, you have to change the other. Regardless, they're meant to drive that decarbonization of major systems first, driving towards a whole building decarbonization. So the emissions factor becomes less important in that sense, because either way, we're still going to be driving towards that ultimate change.
Great, thank you both. Two questions relate to carbon intensivity of heating. One is in relation to wood heating that might be common as an emergency heat or as other heating in some parts of the province, and how we're looking to deal with wood emergency heat in modeling guidelines. And the second one is in relation to the prescriptive path and whether or not local governments will be able to require low carbon heating cooling sources without energy modeling. Those are probably two quite different questions, so maybe it's better to split them up.
Yeah, so with regards to wood heating, it's something that'll be considered within the modeling rule set, but I'll be honest, I don't think it's something that it's not something that we definitely had considered with regards to the emissions. It mainly due to the fact that if you look at the best practice guides for determining emissions factor, wood has an emissions factor that is basically close to zero. So It's something that we will consider as we move through the process of developing the modeling rule set. However, it may be something that is, we understand that wood is being used in some applications as backup heat or whatever. Whether or not that actually gets absorbed within the actual modeling rule set is something we still have to determine.
Yeah, and from a policy perspective, we want people to be safe in their homes. We recognize that backup heat is an important consideration, particularly for those in northern and colder climates. So it's something that we're thinking about carefully to make sure that we're producing something that's equitable and keeps people safe.
Yeah, and so, sorry, Tiffany, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so with regards to that second part of the question, with regards to the prescriptive path and whether or not the carbon pollution standard can apply, yes, we do have a prescriptive option within the carbon pollution standard with regards to Part 9. So the way we've defined it is essentially we have with the medium, which we have the measure only, which does not apply to Part 9 because you're actually not doing the modeling. And then we have the medium, low, and zero carbon ready levels. For each of those, we've defined them as being like for medium as decarbonized heating system energy source. And then for the low, decarbonized heating and surface water heating system energy source. So for that, in terms of the decarbonize, what that means is essentially having emissions factor of electricity or less. So that does allow, allow for, based on the local government's decision on how they want to actually apply that, RNG could be a viable option with regards to that. So there is that option if you do not model, you do have a potential prescriptive route with regards to GHGs in the Part 9 world.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. I'm going to switch over to Q&As. We've had a couple of questions come in through that module for the meeting so far. One is a follow-up in relation to local governments that have previously opted into the STEP code requirements. Would they now be required to also accept the prescriptive pathway? And I think that's following up on something you mentioned, Tiffany. I don't know if you wanted to take the first start at that.
Sorry, I just had a little bit of trouble following you. Not you, it was me. Can you?
Sure, certainly. The question is following up in relation to local governments and authorities having jurisdiction that have previously opted into the STEP code requirements. Are they now required to also accept the prescriptive pathway?
Okay, I see. So in large part, it depends on what you mean when you say previously opted into the STEP code. If they've opted into Step 3 or below, the new minimum standard takes care of that. Step 3 performance options and the prescriptive backstop become the new minimum standard. If you've opted into, say, Step 4 or Step 5, that opt-in would continue to stand.
Great, thank you for that, Tiffany. A different question is on the proportion of building archetypes that are covered by the STEP code, that is, that they fall under 10.2.3 or 9.36.6. And the question is just how many archetypes and the proportion of them are impacted. There may be a perception that there are no changes that are trying to drive down greenhouse gas emissions in other archetypes.
Yeah, understood. Like I said earlier, the carbon pollution standard was based on the analysis that was done with regards to energy efficiency through the metrics research report. So there are some occupancies that have not been included. But with regards to the development of the STEP code and the archetypes that were included, it was really looked at in terms of what was the most impactful, what were the most predominant archetypes, and that's been carried forth in terms of the carbon pollution standard. That's not to say that we're not going to continue to look at this and continue to develop. Type F, Group F occupancies has been something that has been cited as something that we could start to really take a stab at. And providing clarity as well too with different archetypes and different sort of situations. So there's that constant evolution. I think that with the carbon pollution standard, this is one very big step in the right direction, and then refinement from here on in will definitely continue.
Thank you for that, Scott. There's a follow-up question on renewable natural gas and potential developments around tariffs. The root of the question is that if a building meets criteria during design phase based on an assumption of one source of fuel, will the building owner or operator be able to switch to a different type of fuel once the building is commissioned?
Well, I mean, the policy intention is no. The building code sets minimum standards for the construction of buildings. What's happening sort of outside of that, the four corners of the code is a discussion that's ongoing, and part of that is happening at the Utilities Commission. What we know is that when we get that decision, we'll be working with our partners across government and with our various utility providers in BC to make sure that our policy intent is achieved as best possible.
Thanks, Tiffany. For the group, perhaps a simpler question to answer. After public review, what is the timeline for the proposed changes to be in effect?
Our intention is to be producing a regulation for signature by the minister next month, with the intent that it be in force in December 2022, probably mid-month is the anticipated timeline.
Thank you. And a different question this time around. The majority of this discussion and presentation is focused on new buildings, and the question relates to how increases in the prescriptive method may affect renovations or additions or modifications to existing buildings.
Yeah, good question. So as I'm sure you know, we are working on the retrofit code for 2024, which will provide a lot more clarity with regards to this. But I think as it stands right now, like say, for instance, with regards to the STEP code, it's really up to the AHJ to determine whether or not the STEP code would apply to any alterations given the changes to the building, taking into the context of the whole building. So there can be applications where AHJs do determine that that would be something that is warranted. However, it's really up to them to decide what they want to do there. So it'd be no different with the changes that we're proposing for that 20% better improvement.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. There is a follow-up question in relation to Ghg labels, and the question is whether or not local governments would be able to require them if the code is implemented as proposed.
Sorry, can you say it again?
Yeah, certainly. So the question is, if the code is implemented as proposed, would local governments be able to require Ghg labels?
Well, the Ghg labels is something that obviously can be generated through the performance path. So in terms of the requirement of that, Tiffany, do you want to touch on that, maybe based on the work that's being done by Energy and Mines on this?
I know energy labeling is something that they're looking at. It's work that's ongoing. I don't have a great line of sight as to where exactly that's going and when. I can tell you that the building code itself doesn't itself require an energy label. However, this is where the intersection of code and local government implementation and fuel policy all kind of meet. So within the code itself, no. Outside the code, perhaps.
Great, thank you for that. Just taking a look here and trying to see if there's additional questions that are coming up. There's a few comments and discussion back and forth on wood, and there might be a question embedded in one of the statements about whether or not if a local government adopts the zero carbon standard and if projects choose a prescriptive pathway, whether or not the builder would be able to install a wood fireplace for emergency heating. I'm not sure if that's something we can easily comment on, but Scott, maybe there is some thought in that.
Yeah, like we discussed earlier, wood heat in certain areas can be considered as, you know, in terms of backup heat, in terms of safety measures, should there be a power outage, is something that could be viable. Like I said, it's not necessarily something that has been really considered or embedded within the carbon pollution standard as it stands right now, but we will be looking at how this actually rolls out in terms of the modeling rule set. I don't know if there's much information, more information I can provide beyond that.
And I would add to that. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The idea here with the introduction of this new opt-in carbon pollution standard is to lay out a pathway to 2030. Just like we did with the STEP code, we recognize that local governments are going to be piloting these levels, and we're going to learn as we go, and we're going to make refinements as we go. It wasn't necessarily intended, as is laid out in the roadmap, that we immediately jump to those zero carbon levels, because the intent is to phase that in over time, and to do that in a way that's based on the learning that we get from that great pilot work that we're going to see ambitious local governments doing. So yes, are there some question marks? Absolutely, but we need to start somewhere, and our goal is incremental change here.
Great, thank you for that, Tiffany. There is a question again relating to the Vancouver modeling guidelines and corridor pressurization. There's a change in crediting and refrigeration leakage, which might make compliance more challenging. I think the question is whether or not the STEP code will use the latest VMG once it's published, or if we'll have a different method to calculate GHG and corridor pressurization.
Okay. Yeah, like fundamentally, we will, any version of the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines that we reference will be explicit within the code. With regards to the changes that's being proposed in those modeling guidelines, this is obviously something new. It hasn't been absorbed in terms of the analysis that we've done with regards to the archetypes and the STEP code and energy efficiency. And as well, too, is that with our carbon pollution standard, we've by design kept it very simple. This is direct emissions as a result of the use and operation of the equipment within the building, and doesn't necessarily, it doesn't take into account fugitive emissions at all with regards to refrigerant leakage. So these are changes that are being instituted by the City of Vancouver. It doesn't necessarily mean that we'll follow suit with regards to the BC Building Code, and we can always reference the existing version that we have that consistent throughout, and then obviously have those discussions about whether or not changes need to be made and how that actually impacts the metrics moving forward with both energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you for that, Scott. I note that we have one hand up in the participant section, and so what we'll do at this point now is just bounce back and forth between what's typed in the chat and any hands that are raised if anyone wants to speak up. So I see a hand here from Matt Greeno. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Hugo, and thanks, Scott and Tiffany and Zach. Thank you too. I just want to be really explicit. The question about labeling is important because it seems like the context that there is a prescriptive standard, and because that's in code, there's no requirement for the municipality to deviate from that possibility. So this is where the labeling question comes in. It was a yes or no question in terms of how it's phrased. So is it true that the municipalities won't be able to require labeling if the code is implemented as stated? So I know you guys talked around it a little bit, but like it is a yes or no question because of the requirements. And I guess this is an opinion, but like legally speaking, if we can't deviate, fill in the blank.
I'm struggling here to stay in my lane. So there is actually a little bit of nuance around this. I can appreciate from your perspective in terms of the code itself, it is a yes or no answer. The code itself, you're right. My original interpretation stands. All of the other stuff around that, I think that's a great conversation for us to have at the local government peer network in a lot more detail. And I'd love to do that with you.
Like fundamentally, if the prescriptive path is followed, no energy modeling is going to be done. No energy label is going to get produced. So, and local governments, the way it stands right now, cannot restrict whether or not a builder or owner goes for the prescriptive path or the performance path with regards to Part 9.
If I may, it's worth highlighting as well, Matt, now there's certainly at the local government level, the Building Code and Building Act never provided local governments with the authority to require a label. That authority was found elsewhere in terms of local government's administrative ability to require paperwork related to the enforcement of codes and standards. I know the Building Code has has some consequences on other things that local governments do administratively, and that's why I think it makes sense to dive in with our colleagues who manage those other authorities at municipal affairs and energy and mines who look at these programs, and just dive into this and ensure that we're getting thorough input on the implications of this building code matter. But yeah, I just want to make sure it's clear that the team here isn't trying to dodge the question. We're trying to answer only what we can answer based on the building code. The labeling issue has always been one that has always been beyond the code, although the code did always nicely sort of tee that up. And this certainly introduces some potential changes to that process. So something we're open to diving into.
Exactly.
I'll invite others to raise their hand to join the queue to speak if they'd like to. In the meantime, I'll just dive into the chat from a question from Rebecca, who's asked, will there be any consideration in future versions of the code regarding climate resiliency? And was this just not possible in this version of the code because they feel that there was a key opportunity with this version of the code given the carbon pollution standard and cooling?
Great question. Climate resiliency, climate mitigation is an ongoing matter of great concern to the province and to our partners at the national level. And so conversations about how we can more fully address those considerations and do some really great work on those is ongoing both at the national level as well as our ongoing existing buildings renewal strategy, which looks at some of the co-benefits that we might achieve in implementing new energy efficiency requirements for existing buildings in 2024 and how we can make all of the great work and analysis that exists out there already work together more effectively to mitigate those climate impacts and introduce greater resiliency for both existing and new buildings.
Thanks, Tiffany. I just want to check in with our team to see if there was anything in the Q&A or anything in the written chat that we missed.
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. I think at the moment we're doing okay. We're just going back and double checking things. So in case Will or Megan have anything to add in, feel free to jump in. There's ongoing discussion, some comments, but we're looking for other questions we may have missed.
That sounds great. I think I saw a hand raised just briefly from someone. So if that person would just like to unmute and just go ahead.
This Tao. Just one touch to the label thing. I think currently a local government, even they don't, the project doesn't go through the Energy rating. You still actually can require the label, but not the Energy label, right? Just like like a city of Richmond, and they have like a special requirement what's actually energy label should be. Like for example, if you use other energy modeling software, you can produce that energy label similar as to have the same information and a guide. So same thing when you have prescriptive approach for actually similar to step 3, I think local government can require that label as well, but it's just not energy label. That's my thought. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Tao. Let me just see here. Yeah, are there any more questions or anyone who would like to unmute and just chime in with a question? I see a hand up here. Would you like to unmute and go ahead?
Yeah, that's Donald Dignan. I asked the question about what proportion of new buildings are in the archetypes covered under step code, and I think Scott kind of spoke to it. But what I was wondering was like what percentage of new building stock is inside there? Not like how many archetypes are covered under it versus what's not, but are 80% of new buildings or 50% of new buildings inside step code? Or is that something that like a value that you're aware of, or is there a resource where we could look at that?
Well, it's hard to say for certain. It does cover like C, D, and E occupancies, which is hotels and motels, condominiums, apartments, and single-family houses. also retail as well, certain retail occupancies. And so when you think about it, I think it does cover the vast majority, although I don't exactly have the figure offhand. There are some buildings, such as public sector buildings, which is kind of that catch-all term for schools, universities, libraries, that kind of thing, which aren't strictly captured in the step code, although there are some targets. And then there are other, the high risk, mid risk industrial buildings that aren't covered at all. But I'd invite others to kind of speak on this. But from my understanding, occupancy C, D, and E do cover the vast majority of construction here in BC. Any other thoughts or queries? Donald, does that answer your question? I'm sorry, I don't have an exact figure here in front of me.
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. Yeah, it partially answers it, but then it's kind of I guess it would be a good value to try and ascertain from your point of view, so you can fully understand what portion of new buildings you're expecting to impact with it, and there's not a significant portion of buildings left unimproved in the next iteration of updates.
You're right, Donald. We're always looking for more data. We are a data-driven branch. Our work is scientifically based, and we're always looking for more granular information. It is a perpetual initiative in the branch.
Yeah, thanks.
Sounds good. Other questions?
If there's no other questions, I'd follow up on that. If there's yeah, data-driven branch, and I mean there's incremental targets, so the step code targets are getting more difficult to achieve. How do you determine success of the past targets, and is there stuff like metered data to show that buildings that have been built under the previous step code are actually achieving what they're targeted to achieve? Or is it like are you measuring it on a grid level to see if you can drive down emissions and such? Basically, how are you measuring success of these targets changing?
Yeah, simple answer to that in terms of the actual performance of a building as opposed to the model performance. No, we do not have that data. That's something that, with the evolution of energy efficiency in buildings, and as we look at existing buildings as well too, and seeing how we could potentially collate data with regards to information via utilities, and aggregating building types in communities. That's something that I'm really hoping will be more available in the future. It's not something that we have right now. And in terms of gauging the success of the current metrics and applicability, this is all really with regards to engagement with stakeholders and local governments, for them providing their input with regards to what they're seeing is working, what some gaps may be, maybe some loopholes, and that's all the evolution of the step code and the carbon pollution standard, is getting that input so we can make the necessary changes to accommodate certain edge cases.
Good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Scott.
We have one question. That success, at least from a corporate perspective, was really, as I noted at the beginning, when we set out with the step code in 2017, success was about being in this place at this time, able to consider implementing step 3 for part 9 at least, broadly across the province. And so we tracked that through local government adoption and how widely the step code is being picked up. So to that degree, we're largely towards that goal. The presence of a prescriptive backstop certainly indicates we have more work to do and that we need to help bring along some builders, and that work will continue. But our success has been defined to this degree over the last 5 to 7 years of step code, more on implementation of the policy widely and ensuring that the industry is transitioning towards a more performance and sophisticated approach to construction, with the assumption that that's much better than what we were doing in the past, which was really flying blind on homes. But we've got colleagues who'll be looking more at sort of audits building by building and other studies, and colleagues such as BC Housing who've done some studies on some buildings that have been quite promising in terms of the actual energy use of high performance buildings. But for us, it's really about seeing that market transformation towards a more sophisticated systems-based approach, which we've seen and enables us to consider the package that we're looking at today.
Thanks for that, Zach. We have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat as people are processing and reflecting on the information that they've received so far. One is sort of related to the past set of questions, which is, are we able to comment on the extent to which the full carbon impact of bodies or of buildings, such as embodied carbon, is being considered in this or the next code iteration?
Yeah. So do you want to go ahead, Tiffany, with this one? Or?
Well, I'll start off and then you can dive in. What I can tell you is that this is part of that climate mitigation and resilience piece that we're looking at all levels of government and thinking about very deeply. As I imagine you can appreciate, embodied carbon is a little bit more complex nut to crack, and that's why we started with operational carbon first. But certainly that whole package and that whole picture is something that we're cognizant of and thinking about and aware of, and is informing code development as we go forward. We've got colleagues across the provincial and federal governments who are thinking about low carbon building materials and strategies to increase their use and availability in the market, and looking forward to those developments as time goes on. Our next full edition of the code is expected in 2023, with the existing buildings and energy efficiency requirements in 2024. So in terms of code cycles, we're on a 5-year cycle. It seems far away in some senses, but it's also quite close in terms of the code development cycle and where we're at in terms of producing that next edition of the code. So incremental change, one thing at a time. We are thinking about that, but go ahead, Scott, if you want to add more detail.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in terms of all the work that's been done with regards to energy efficiency, operational carbon was the next logical step. Like Tiffany insinuated, embodied carbon, there's a lot going on there in terms of trying to figure out what is a viable method, and the data as well too with regards to those embodied carbon values. So this is something that obviously we're keenly interested in and will continue to build on. We're also looking at our national counterparts as well too, and seeing the work that's being done nationally with regards to this. They are asking these very similar questions. So seeing what's happening nationally, and then we can make the decisions accordingly to see what can happen with regards to embodied emissions. But it's something that is down the road. We're focusing obviously right now on operational carbon.
Great, thank you for that, Scott and Tiffany. There's a question about local government's bylaws and the STEP code. And the question is, if the local government wants to opt into the STEP code or update their bylaws for higher steps, please confirm that the minimum step would be step 4 for part 9 and step 3 for part 3.
Essentially, yeah, if they're going to opt in. Otherwise, they have the minimum mandatory requirements that we're proposing in these code changes.
Great, thank you. Scott, there's a question on fenestration in the chat, and it refers to code tables. Have you seen the numbers and stuff? Are you able to answer that one?
I did, yeah. So the question was with regards to the U value for climate zones 4 and 5 as being 1.84. This conflicts with the energy efficiency standards regulation, which now has a U value of 1.61. Great question. With regards to the energy efficiency standards regulation, this is all point of sale and manufacture. It's not design and installation. So we take a bit of a different approach with the BC building code, so we don't necessarily align with the ESR. But, you know, like, logistically, if you have an owner builder that is going out to buy fenestration and they're only able to get a U value of 1.61, well, that's going to dictate what they actually install within the building. And so that's not necessarily reflected within the BC building code itself. I will note, however, that with regards to part 9 residential, the new prescriptive tables do apply. And when you're looking at that U value of 1.84, that would be for non-residential or mixed use applications only. And so we're looking at a increased stringency of 1.22 as the baseline. So that even goes well beyond the energy efficiency standards regulation. So just something to note.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate your fluency with the tables. It helps me understand things a lot more as well. There's a question in relation to design versus reality of buildings, modeling, and step code. The person asking the question notes that occasionally municipal staff find disparities between built and design, and they ask whether or not increased funding for enforcement or checking might be made available. And someone further on, in a similar vein, notes that commissioning may be vital to this process. So the question is whether or not increased funding for enforcement or checking may be made available.
Yeah, Tiffany, do you maybe want to comment on that?
Sorry, I lost my mute button for a second there. At this point, I can say that funding is not part of the current proposal, the policy proposal in relation to code changes. That said, there is lots of work ongoing within the Office of Housing and Construction Standards, of which we are a branch, looking at how best to support local governments to achieve the changes that we're hoping to achieve at a policy level, both in terms of increasing affordability and access to housing and increasing the overall quality and safety of housing. So stay tuned.
Also worth noting that, as with all other parts of the building code, enforcement is at the pleasure of the authority having jurisdiction, the local government or regional district. Doing so, that tends to be self-funded through permits and inspection fees or other forms of funding that. And also always worth remembering, while we have new requirements, these are replacing previous requirements on energy efficiency. And so the degree to which local governments were able to enforce energy efficiency since 2012, when we first introduced regulation there that was implemented into the BC building code related to energy efficiency in any kind of comprehensive way. It's really a matter of inspecting differently. And what we have found is that performance-based approach can certainly speed up the process, and local governments may want to take a look at what their enforcement regime is and make sure it's fit to the different processes available in the updated code here.
Yeah, and just wanted to also touch on that performance gap between the actual performance of the building and the model performance. Yeah, that's, we're well aware that there could be some discrepancies there. And, as we move forward with additional energy efficiency measures, maybe at some point in time, we'll have a much better idea of what that actually means, but at this stage, we don't. With regards to commissioning, that's not something that is a mandate for us. It's a bit of a tough nut to crack. I fully understand the value in it, but at the same time, when you look at the BC Building Code, and once occupancy permit has been issued, that's essentially where it ends, and commissioning extends typically well beyond issuance of the occupancy permit. So there's some complications there with regards to commissioning, but at any rate, it's not something that we're looking at right now.
Great, thank you, everyone. I have a couple of questions that have come from local governments. One, or about local governments. One is if a local government has a policy of step 3 or step 2 with a low carbon energy system for part 3 buildings, will we need to now align this policy with the new carbon tiers, i.e. medium, low, etc.?
Do you want to take this, Tiffany?
The intent is that the Building Act General Regulation, limited on restriction, will specify that local governments are able to introduce their own building regulations, so long as they're choosing one of the operational carbon pollution standard levels. Similar to the STEP code, it could have implications. Without reading exactly the language of your bylaw, it would be difficult for me to offer more granular guidance, but I would suggest checking in on that with your legal counsel if you have specific concerns.
Thanks, Tiffany. In a similar vein, there's a question about whether or not the local government would be able to mix and match STEP code and GHGIs, for example, step 5 or step 4 with low carbon.
Yes, that is the intent, for you to be able to match your steps and levels with those step up, step down structures that we've seen be so successful with so many local government partners.
Great, thank you. A follow-up in a similar vein just came in about whether or not the alignment to low carbon tiers applies to rezoning policies or just building bylaws.
It would apply to building bylaws, but again, there's lots of tricky little nuances in there, so it's really a contextual analysis of exactly what your bylaws and zoning bylaws say. And I would really suggest having a good conversation with your legal counsel, because I would not purport to offer legal advice on that.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. Changing tracks a little bit to a slightly more technical question. There's a question in relation to the reference house. So with updates to the reference house proposed to meet these new prescriptive requirements, would this not make it more difficult to achieve the higher steps, 4 or 5, under the % improvement metric versus the current code, or have we considered this elsewhere in the updates?
Yeah, so the baseline case, the reference case stays as it is. So what you currently use within the 2018 version of the BC Building Code is what stands for with regards to these proposed revisions. So the baseline case doesn't change because we have the more stringent prescriptive tables. Those are not meant for the modeling purpose. Those are meant for prescriptive compliance only. So that's the reason why we kept the old tables in there, is because those old tables help to inform that % better modeling process. So that whole process is not going to change from what you're currently doing right now.
Awesome, thank you, Scott. Another technical question is that there can sometimes be challenges modeling dual fuel systems, such as heat pumps with gas backup in Part 9, and meeting GHGI targets. Are we able to comment on how there might be guidance incorporated in the rule set, or how modeling could be simplified?
Yeah, that's so in concert with NRCan and the EnerGuide rating system. We're going to take a closer look at some of the nuances within the calculation methodology that they use. And so guidance will be provided regardless through the modeling rule set that we are proposing for the new year to account for those backup systems and what that actually means. So, you know, there may be situations where we just have basically a certain cutoff, or if we're looking at the EnerGuide rating system, if that's the method of compliance, they do account for it in some degree, and is that going to be enough? So that's all with regards to the process that we're going to be going through with regards to developing this modeling rule set. This will be looked at more closely, and more direction will be provided.
Thanks for that, Scott. That's all that we have right now for written questions, Hugo, but we'll keep monitoring.
Sounds good. I can move on now. In this case, if there's any folks who want to chime in, you know, please feel free to unmute yourselves. I see that there is not anyone in the queue right now.
Hi, this is Tao. You know, thank you actually, everyone. You know, you guys did a fantastic job actually to, in such a short period, come up with the GGI targets. Quick questions actually. You add a prescription path for the step 3. That seems actually is you know, step away from like a performance-driven approach. My question is actually, do you see that more prescriptive path is coming for other like step 4 Part 9 buildings, or this is just like a temporary one? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. At this point, the prescriptive backstop is limited and temporary to this next progression, the 20% better and step 3 equivalent. And it was really born of an ongoing discussion that we've been having with communities in rural and remote northern locations who are having still some pressures accessing local energy advisor expertise or certain high performance building materials. And so the idea here is really to sort of support from all sides. So we're introducing the prescriptive option for 20% better, but at the same time, we're working really hard with our partners across government and Crown agencies to support market transformation. So we've got incentives and rebates coming from our colleagues with low carbon innovation. We've also got BC Housing offering, requiring over the next couple of years, builders to demonstrate competency with STEP code as a condition of their license renewal or application. We're increasing training and supporting training opportunities. The idea here being that as we're supporting those local governments who are having challenges accessing that expertise and those building materials, we're also moving the market to make sure that that availability is there, so that when we get to step 4, we won't have to have a prescriptive backstop because we've completed that market transformation and we've supported the market to get to where it needs to be successful for all communities.
Thank you.
Kevin, I see there's a new question in the chat.
Yeah, Scott, I think this one's probably one that you might be able to help us with. It's in relation to Table 9, 3627D, referencing fenestration and doors, and whether or not that applies to all kinds of doors.
It does, but there are allowances within the code that provide some exceptions with regards to, say, swing doors. So I just encourage whoever's asking this question just to take a look at the code. You will see that there are some allowances that are provided for other things. You know, like typically with regards to sliding glass doors, is not something that is really a big issue with regards to the U-value compliance. It's when you get to swing doors where it becomes a little bit more nuanced. So there are some allowances within the code that do account for those.
Thanks for that, Scott.
I'm also seeing a question in the chat about backup systems and dual fuel systems, and I wasn't sure if that had been addressed yet.
So.
Yeah, so it was reading, whether or not there could be challenges modeling dual fuel systems, for example, heat pump with gas backup, and there may be guidance coming soon. So is there any initial thinking into how modeling these systems could be simplified?
Yeah, so we did address that question. So yeah, it will be accounted for in the modeling rule set. So
apologies there. I see a new question in the chat about whether or not AHJs can choose to require a performance or prescriptive path of the carbon pollution standard, or are we required to let the developer choose?
Great question. So similar to the STEP code where you choose your step, with the new operational carbon standard, you choose your level, but those multiple compliance paths are all open to the builder.
Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, are there any other questions in the chat or folks who want to chime in? Okay, I'll give it a second or two. But yeah, I know that this meeting is technically scheduled to go for 11:30, but we can end early if there are no other questions, either in the chat or verbally. I see another hand up. Donald?
Yeah, the question I asked at the start that Tiffany answered, I guess, half of the question about the zero carbon ready. She described what it was. The other half of the question was, is that defined in the code?
There is not a defined term in the code. However, I would say that zero carbon ready is defined in terms of the table, which lays out the metrics or targets for that level.
Yeah, and I guess just following on from that, why is the GHG table looks a lot like your traditional step code table? Why are they now using I guess tiers that are using words as opposed to like a numbered tier where, because zero carbon ready is a little bit, it's not clear what it means being at the bottom of the table, whereas 1, 2, 3, 4 are clearly just arbitrary numbers.
No great mystery there. A piece of it is branding and a piece of it is comprehension. So as we were developing this standard, we wanted to help folks differentiate between step code steps and carbon pollution standard levels. There's also the national system, which has tiers. And so it was an effort on our part to reduce confusion there. But also when you start talking about 1, 2, 3, 4 or higher or lower when it comes to carbon pollution standards, it can get really confusing about what you mean. So which one is better, which direction is better can change based on your perspective. So it was an effort on our part to try and introduce clarity around something that can be conceived in multiple ways.
Understood. And then just, is it correct that they're not in any way tied to a step? So authorities can adopt like step 3 and measure only, or they could adopt you know, a lower step and zero carbon ready. Basically, it would just change your fuel mix, I think.
Well, they wouldn't be able to adopt a lower step than step 3 for Part 9 buildings because that's going to become the new minimum standard. But I can say that the carbon pollution levels were designed with the assumption that 20% better would be the new minimum base standard in code, for example. And so they're tied in that way. But in terms of choosing beyond that, if you wanted to choose step 4 or 5 and any of the carbon levels, you could do that.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so in terms of the energy efficiency, you know, it is tied to the minimum energy efficiency requirements, but beyond that, there's no linkage.
Understood. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. There's a few more questions that have come up in the chat. The first one is, could a local government provide a two-step approach with an incentive to build a lower step with a prescriptive pathway?
It's interesting. It seems like a lot of the questions have been about the opposite.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to unpack that a bit. You couldn't go lower than the minimum standard step. So that's step 3 for Part 9 and step 2 for Part 3 buildings. But in terms of incentives amongst those, typically those programs are outside the 4 corners of the code. Obviously, you need to be careful that you're not introducing building requirements because that would put you offside of the restrictions under the Building Act. But incentive programs can operate outside of that sort of more narrow document of the code.
I'm seeing Carolyn actually provided a clarification, which makes a little more sense. I think about an incentive to use the performance pathway. And Carolyn, I think what is helpful to recall is that like time before the step code, when I think of in particular City of North Vancouver, examples you're probably quite familiar with, did all sorts of work to, without the step code, encourage builders to use the performance path and really identify some of the advantages of that path from a permits and processing perspective, and then create a slightly different process for people doing the prescriptive code. And they managed to move a lot of their market voluntarily through their administrative processes towards a performance-based approach. All of those tools, as far as I'm aware, in terms of authorities of local government to create the administrative processes for different compliance paths still exist. And it may be worth, ideally, with your peers across the region, coming up with some approaches that help direct builders in the way that's the most efficient from a processing perspective. And absolutely, a performance-based approach is a superior product when and where that's, the resources are available to do so. And in a lot of our urban areas, that's certainly the case. And so as far as we're aware, the authorities local governments have and had in the past haven't changed in that regard. And so it's certainly worth taking a look at whether your policies and programs encourage the kind of builder behavior that you're looking for in your community, with the caveat that the paths that exist in the code shall be accepted in some format. What administrative process is used for each of those paths is up to the local government.
And one thing just to kind of add to that, when we looked at creating the prescriptive path, there are additional requirements when it comes to fenestration and wall assemblies, as well as the requirement for high efficiency equipment, which does not exist in the performance path. And in our conversations with builders and industry, we found that if you have ready access to an energy advisor, it is highly likely that the performance path will be cheaper than the prescriptive one. There are areas in which there are really high travel costs incurred by energy advisors who have to travel very long distances and bill for that time, in which case the prescriptive path may make more financial sense. But I think all these factors kind of combine, I hope to incentivize the performance path where possible. And I also just wanted to make a clarification to an earlier question about the definition of zero carbon. For us, a decarbonized building is one that is at or better than a figure for hydroelectricity, which is currently described in the City of Vancouver Energy Modeling Guidelines, which I believe is 0.011 kilograms of GHG per kilowatt hour, I believe, but I'm just going off the top of my head there. But anyway, there is a definition inside the modeling rule set.
there is also a definition of decarbonized fuel source in the code language itself. So it's looking at that same efficiency factor.
There we go. Okay. I see there are a few more questions in the chat here.
Yeah, there's one that's following up on the discussion that we just had about performance paths and prescriptive paths. And this question is, if you can't require the performance path, but you can incentivize the performance path. I think I'm reading that correctly. Does that make sense as a question? You can't require it, but you can incentivize it?
Vast generalization, yes.
I think one thing, to also be mindful of, with that is there is a lot of work that will be happening over the next several months at the STEP Code peer network level to develop a set of best practices and shared understandings between local governments who are interested in, in incentivizing or, how they want to reach the targets that they've set. And we know that consistency on the local government level is something that has been concerning for builders and for industry. And so if there's any way to align any incentive structures that may exist, these are the kinds of conversations that will be happening on the peer network level over the coming months. And when that guidance comes out, I think it would be easier and also beneficial for all those who are interested to move in lockstep to provide some degree of standardization on a regional scale.
Thanks for that, Hugo. Another question in the domain of local governments. There's a comment that there isn't a great deal of consistency about the requirements of the STEP code and GHGI amongst local governments, and that the proposed amendments may not help establish a baseline of consistency. The question is there a schedule to remove the opt-in and opt-out options so that everyone is building to the same code?
Yes. So you saw that with our introduction of the STEP code, and we're right on target. We're moving to 20% better in 2022. The next steps are 2027 and 2030.
2032 for energy efficiency, 2030 for carbon.
Right. With respect to the operational carbon standard, the roadmap tells us that those are intended to be phased in over 2024, 2027, and 2030. So there is a schedule. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that, a point to be made here is, as well as we ramp up stringency, we start to reduce the number of options for the local governments, which starts to streamline the process across the province.
Great, thanks everyone. There's a question from Pete. Is there a point in time where you or government will estimate what percentage reduction of GHG we have achieved with these latest codes versus the 2007 GHG level? Presumably, this would take into account all code changes since 2007 for new buildings.
I'm happy to jump in with that. Pete, that is work that has been done in the past and will continue to be done as part of the province's work on various climate action initiatives. We don't do the modeling ourselves, but the changes to building codes are proposed as part of anticipated reductions, and then the actual results are accounted for in the, the Climate Change Accountability report, I believe, that comes out annually is the name of the report, and I think it usually comes out in late November or December. So stay tuned for updates on where we're at, and they usually break that down sector by sector.
Thanks for that, Zach. Hugo, I think we've gone through all the ones that are in the chat and the Q&A at the moment.
I guess I'll kind of I sense that the questions are slowing down. Correct me if I'm wrong, and we maybe wrap this up in a few minutes. But if there's any final questions verbally that anyone wants to go for, just go ahead and do it.
There's one.
Sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, there's one that I'm advised we may have missed, and it's whether or not GHGI metrics would be included in the retrofit energy code in 2024.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, that's the one I was highlighting. Yeah, like right now we're focusing on energy efficiency for the retrofit code. So, but simply no. But you know, as we continue to go down this road, we'll continue to look at GHGIs and how this actually applies to retrofits. But for 2024, we're focusing on energy efficiency at this point.
Thanks for that. Are there any final questions that folks want to pose, either in the chat or verbally? Pause for like a second or two.
This Tao, I just want to add my thought about that at one of our early questions regarding that if you can go prescriptive path plus some low carbon target. You know, to get at the low carbon, you have to calculate use Ghg modeling for priority building. Do you have to do Ghg modeling to get your GGI number? So if you are doing the Ghg modeling anyway, so I think it's easier just go in the energy, actually, you go performance path rather than prescription path. That's my thought. Thanks.
Yeah, just to note, Tal, is that we do have the prescriptive path with regards to the carbon pollution standard as well, too. So there is that option of not doing any energy modeling and then still being able to have some impact with regards to GHG emissions. That won't be measured, but it will essentially be by dealing with the different equipment and whether or not in the fuel source as well too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott.
And my understanding is that the prescriptive path is only applicable to Part 9 buildings, whereas for Part 3 buildings, it will continue to be performance only.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that might actually wrap it up unless there's anything else. Any last final comments? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the session. Thank you so much to our presenters who fielded all those questions. The public review period ends November 4th at 11:59 p.m. So please submit your questions and your comments via the SurveyMonkey tool. If you have any questions about the process, please feel free to email bssb.public.review@gov.bc.ca up until that time. If there's nothing else, thank you so much to all of our participants and to our presenters. Have a good rest of the day.